whoever joins us later can catch up. Bismillah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome to another session of Lisān Lab. A conversation on language while being very conscious of the fact that we are using language to have this conversation. And it's as I try to mention every week, it's great that we, for us to have a small group. Small group usually means it's easier for people to kind of bounce ideas off of each other and share ideas. But khair, inshallah. And also there's kind of an open call to anybody that wants to start their own series with me or even with other people is fine as well. But since I love etymology, I started this project to have conversations about language. So if there's any other topics that you're interested in, please reach out and we can start another series delving into language and deeper meanings. Okay, so today, inshallah, we'll be actually doing things a little bit differently. I think this is maybe the 6th session. I think we had 2 for Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, and then Al-Malik Al-Quddus As-Salam. Yeah, so that's so this will be the 6th session. So usually I just kind of start by asking if anybody has any thoughts they'd like to share, or any ideas or any reflections on those, on the name. So usually, like I said, we do one name at a time. But this time, I think it will be beneficial to do 2 names at a time. So those 2 names will be المؤمن and المهيمن. And I'll get into the reasons for why we'll do both names in a few minutes. But yeah, just off the bat, does anybody have any thoughts they want to share on these 2 names, or any ideas, or any questions, or anything like that? Khair, inshallah. They're very interesting names, I think. So I think the conversation can go in a lot of different directions. But let's get started then. So the main reason that we're going to take a look at both names at the same time, and let me just add the Arabic here as well, is that by most accounts, these 2 names have the same root. So that's the first thing. So if we go back to the main list here, the translations that I got here from, I'm not sure where I got this list from, but the one who gives Iman for Al-Mu'min, and the guardian, the witness, the overseer for Al-Muhaymin. So these 2 names here. So you'll see that in the application here, both names... Oh, this back button is not working. Well, that's unfortunate. But as you can see, if we click on Al-Mu'min, the root is the same here. Alif, Mim, and Nun. And if we click on Al-Muhaymin, the root is the same. And we'll do a little quick sarf or morphology lesson here to kind of understand why that's the case. And this is explained in the entry that Lane has for the base word here. So if we start with Al-Mu'min, the stem is Mu'min. And that's normally actually translated as believer, right? Because we say in Islam. You have Islam, and then you have Iman, and then you have Ihsan. Right, so as if you enter Islam, you become a Muslim, and if you have faith, and if you believe, you become a mu'min. So those two words have what we call the active participle form, or ismul fa'il, meaning they are doers. They are words that describe a doer of some sort. And actually, I reformatted the Excel sheet that we had, keeping track of this, to kind of make it a little bit easier to read. And so, yeah, you have a column here for the form names. And so far, most of the names that we come across are active participles. So they describe a person or an entity doing a thing. Like when we say Rahman and Rahim, those are active participles. Kind of like how in English we have the ER suffix or the IST suffix, or the ologist suffix, right? These are all suffixes that indicate a certain kind of actor, a certain kind of doer of some sort. So that's kind of the first thing that I think strikes anybody that first hears this name of Allah, right? Because it's the same exact word that we use to describe ourselves. And this is not the first time that this happens in the Arabic language, and it's not the first time that happens in the Quran, right? There are many names of God and words that we use to describe God that we also use to describe human beings, and that Allah himself also uses to describe believers, or human beings rather. The best example off the top of my head is Sami'an Basir, right? Allah describes himself as all hearing and all seeing, but he also describes humans that way. Forget the name of the surah, but I can provide that reference later. So that's the first question I kind of want to just throw out there. If anybody has any thoughts on like that, well, you are you are a mu'min, and then we also say Allah is al-mu'min. So, like I said, normally we go into the root first, so I think that allows the conversation to open up a little bit more. This time we're starting with the form, so it's a little bit more technical. So no problem if nobody has any initial thoughts there. Okay, so now the relationship between these two names and why we are, how they come from the same root. So that's the reason that we're doing two names today, Al-Mu'min and Al-Muhaymin, is because by most accounts, both of these names have the same root, alif, mim, and nun. So Lane explains this a bit here, but it's a little bit hard to understand, so I'll try to kind of explain it in the simplest morphological terms. So active participles, or doers, or subjects in Arabic come in a few different forms. The most basic form is fa'il, right? So we say fa'il means somebody that does something, right? So like katib is a writer, khaliq is a creator, so that's one form, right? And then if we take that form and we make it intense, right, we get fa'al, right? So that's somebody that is doing something intensively, repeatedly, over and over again. It just has some kind of meaning of intensity. Another form that we have, right? This is the week that we're on right here. Another form that we have is muf'il, right? So muf'il is also an active participle. It also describes an actor, and then if we intensify it, it becomes mufa'il. So that's what's happening here. So it's a little confusing. So let me try to be as clear as possible. But no worries if you don't get this, because if you don't get it on the first explanation, because it's a little tricky to describe in English, and even as an Arabic speaker, Took me a little bit to understand it. So if you take fa'il, right, that's a noun for describing an actor of some sort, and then you make it intense, you get fa'al. Right, like in the Quran, Allah says, fa'alun lima yurid. He is the one who does whatever he wishes to an intense degree whenever he wishes. Yeah. And then the other form, excuse me. The other form of the active participle is muf'il. Like mu'min. Mu'min, muf'il. Trying to think of some other examples off the top of my head. Muf'il, musrif, one who spends a lot. Anyway, so if you make that form intensive, you get mufa'il. So that's what's happening here. So if you take mu'min, believer, or the name of Allah, and you make it intense, you somehow get muhaymin. So the way that this happens, and Lane explains this here, is that the form should actually be, if you go from mu'min and you make it intense, it should actually be mu'atmin, right? But the Arabs have a tendency to take that hamza, and they tend to switch it to either a ha or a ya. And it's like a dialect thing. It's like a lightness of the tongue thing. So then what happens is mu'atmin either becomes muhatmin, or it becomes mu'aymin, and then eventually that became muhaymin. So that's the reason why we're doing both of these names at the same time, is because they have basically the same grammatical form. One is just the intensive form of the other, and they come from the same root. So sorry if I butchered that explanation. If anybody has any questions, it might be easier to clarify it in the group chat or with text or with more examples.
I had a question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So first of all, wow, that was crazy. I didn't know that. I was literally wondering, I was like, how come like Hamza and Ha or and Ha are phonemes, right? Like they contrast for meaning in Arabic. So how can these two names have the same root? But yeah, I guess it makes sense in terms of ease of articulation. But so did you say that muf'il is the same as fa'il? Like it's another form of fa'il?
It's not another form of fa'al, but it's another morphological form that means an actor. To me,
But does it not mean like causer, do you think? So I'll just give you an example. So like what's the difference between, for example, fattah, or let's say fatih for ease of just to make the example easy, versus mufattih? Is it not someone who's causing something to be opened versus like, so fattah, the way I understand it, fattah is the one who opens repeatedly, consistently, and then mufattih, for example, one of the names is mufattih al-abwab. It's not in the 99, but it's musabib al-asbab, right? That's more common, I guess. But yeah, that one is like more obvious, like a causal form. So I'm wondering if mufa'il is the intensive of muf'il. Does muf'il not imply causer as opposed to doer of the act himself?
No, you're absolutely right on the mark. So the problem is in translating kind of like these grammatical terms, right? Because it's really like you're right. It's an abstraction over an abstraction, kind of to make it But yeah, in a lot of ways, nouns in Arabic that begin with the meme have that causal kind of like form, right? So like we say kataba means to write, kitab is a book, katib is a writer, and then we say maktaba, right? That's a place of books, right? Or place where books come from, or place where books are. So that meme often has that causal kind of sense to it. Absolutely correct. And I think the root that you gave the example was fataha, right? So that's an interesting example, right? Because you can say fatih, which means usually in colloquial it means open, right? But it is an active participle. And the thing is, with active participles, they actually they can be passive, right? They can be passive or they can be active, right? So they can imply something is doing something, or they can imply that something is being done to it. um, and when we're talking about doing something, when we're talking about being active, right? I think the example that you gave was mufattih, right? And that's the intensive form. The non-intensive form actually will be uh, muftih, right? Or what we say more often is muftah, which is actually a key, right? So you see how the relationship's kind of like as a key, right? In like a really kind of abstract, poetic, philosophical sense. A key can be a doer, right? You can anthropomorphize it, for example, right? You can make it like a subject, right? Like, and in a sense, you can think of it like an individual, a conscious person. They can be a key as well. So you have you have both of these senses here of like active participle, a doer, um, causer, but also this sense of like instrumentation, and that's something that I also kind of get from the concept of believer, right? Like as a believer, right? As mu'mineen, right? We are active participles, right? We are doers, right? But there's also the sense of, with this form of muf'il, right? There's also the sense of being an instrument, right? Being an instrument of God, and that's kind of one of the senses that I get from this form, and that word mu'min when used in the sense of human beings. I don't know if that answers your question, right? So the problem is mostly, I think, in my opinion, a matter of like terminology, right? It's a semantic thing. Like, how do we actually describe, these these ideas in language? What's the best way to kind of describe them? Um, yeah. So did that kind of answer?
I also thought of the more common. I think it's probably the most common example of mufa'il in terms of it's not in 99, but it's in a hadith, muqallib al-qulub.
Yeah.
And that is, of course, also someone who is turning. So I think when you said like key, and in terms of instrument, it's also like something being used to cause something else, right?
Right.
And similarly, it's like this image of, for example, a key turning in a lock and opening a door, and then like God holding our hearts in between his fingers and turning them. And I think for me, like, so by instrument, just to clarify, by instrument, you mean like something that is being used to cause something, right? Something else, the act.
Right. Exactly, like a key, right? Like exactly how you would think of like a key. Um, Let me see if I could think of some more examples with this form. So you have like muftah.
There's also musarrif, I think in the same hadith, musarrif al-qulub and muqallib al-qulub.
Yeah, musarrif. Musarrif is the intensive form. So yeah, so you lose a little bit of that instrumentality kind of thing, right? But I think I think this is a good segue into the root, right? Normally we start talking about the root and the idea is there, and then we shift to the form. But really, I just wanted to present the relationship between these two words, and how they come from the same root, and how they're both like uh, um, active participles, one being the intensive form of the other. And this is here for reference in this that Lisān Lab sheet as well, so you can kind of see here like Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim is fi'lan and fa'il, and those are intensive active participles. But this is just a quick side note here. Rahim, right? Just because it's sort of related to your question. Rahim can also be considered a passive participle, right? So we haven't really come across any passive participles so far, except for Quddus. And even Quddus it's a really rare form, right? Like we said in that session, there's only like 5 or 6 words in the Arabic language that have that form. Subuh being like one of the other common ones, and all the other ones being very, very rare. So really, like in common vernacular, it's an intensive passive participle, but it's only used twice in like, common Arabic language. There's a famous saying by Ibn Arabi that I read once, and I'm not a very well-read Ibn Arabi student at all, but he says something that I think is really interesting. He says, "Ana habibukum ay muhibbukum," right? So he's saying that I am your habib, right? I am your lover, but he's saying I don't mean it in the sense of a passive participle, which is how it's mostly used, right? Like if you say ya habibi, right? Usually it means a passive participle, because usually you're saying, oh, you who I love so much, right? You are somebody that I love so much, right? You're not saying it in the sense of like you are somebody that loves me, right? But Ibn Arabi, he's I think what I read was he was elected to some like position of power or something like that, and that's why he said that statement. So he said, "Ana habibukum ay muhibbukum," meaning that like I'm the one who loves you. You don't really love me, or is kind of the implication. And then there's like a line of poetry that he says that he wrote, I think, after that incident, which is "Rubba habibin nasih ghayru mahbub." So like, how often is it that there is a wise habib, a wise lover in the active participle sense, that his love is not reciprocated. So I think it's kind of I don't know much about Ibn Arabi, but you get a kind of like intellectual kind of my understanding or my sense of him is he has this kind of like intellectual like aura, right? So he highly regards the mind, and deep thought and abstraction. So he kind of distinguishes people in that way. So I think that's kind of what I get from that statement of I am your lover, or I am your habib, but not in the sense that you guys normally mean it. So just a quick segue there on like how that form, that morphological form, fa'il, like rahim, like sami', basir, it can be both active and passive depending on the context. But yeah, like Aziz will be the next word that we do, and that's pretty clearly to me a passive participle. But again, there's like a little bit of, we have to be a little bit careful when we're talking about language, using language, like how we best describe these ideas in language is a little bit tricky, right? Like Rahim is usually said that it's not passive, right? It's usually like we say it in the sense of being an active participle, right? Like Allah is Rahim, meaning He's constantly engaging in acts of rahmah. But you can think of it also in the sense of being a passive participle, I think, because it would just simply mean that Allah has made Himself, in the state of being merciful, right? And that's also found in the Quran, right? Because Allah says, "Kataba ala nafsihi rahma," right? Like I have made it like law upon myself, or obligatory upon myself, to be merciful. Right? So you can kind of, that's another way I kind of see that these words are that form fa'il. It can be passive. Okay, yeah, so I think now we can get into yeah, please, somebody raise their hand. Sorry for the infinity screens. I think I saw a raised hand. I think it was Megd. If you're saying something, yeah, it's still raised. Did you want to say something? We can't hear you if you are saying something. Okay, we'll just move on. So, unless anybody has any thoughts, we'll just kind of expand the root here and turn off the Arabic because it gets a little bit difficult to read. Yeah, so like I said with some of the other roots that we've been doing and words so far, is that a lot of the words that we've done so far are very intuitive. So it's not like a Rahman or Rahim where there's this idea of mercy being connected to the idea of a womb, which is kind of a wild metaphor and not something that's very common. But a lot of the other ideas that we came across so far, they're very intuitive. And I think this is still the case here. So there's a lot of familiar words, I think. Actually, maybe I'll keep it in Arabic. There's a lot of familiar words, I think, that would come to mind when we look at this root, right? So again, we're saying that both names, Al-Mu'min and Al-Muhaymin, they come from the same three-letter root, Alif, Mim, and Nun. So there's a lot of other words in Islam, in the Quran, in Arabic, that come from this root. Specific to Islam is, like we said, a mu'min is a believer. So there's the name of God, and there's also the description of human beings as being believers. There's iman, which we usually translate as faith. There's amana, right, which we usually translate as a trust of some sorts. Amin, right? That's again that. So amin is a passive participle, right? And it clearly has that sense of like not an active doer, but somebody who is trusted, right? Like everybody trusts him, as opposed to like someone who's amin, right? That's an active participle, and that's somebody that's actively believing in something. Okay, I think that's enough morphology, but yeah. So I just any thoughts right away on this idea here of, let me switch it back to English actually. The idea of believing, right? The idea of a trust, the idea of faith, being connected to safety, right? Does that strike anybody as kind of like, what is that? What's the initial kind of like gut reaction? Like how do you explain faith to a child? I think that's kind of often where I like to start these conversations, about the root, at least. Like, how do we know that this concept how do we ground this concept in reality? How do we ground the concept of being a believer or having faith, in reality?
Can I say something?
Of course.
Yeah, so the first thing that this reminded me of was also, in addition to what you said earlier about how this is a name we ascribe to ourselves, not just us, like, Rasulullah. It reminded me of a hadith, which was also really deep in terms of embodying the names, Al-Mu'min, Mir'at al-Mu'min. And like, it's just really deep because it's like, which, it's usually translated, the believer is a mirror of the believer. And I mean, in terms of context, it does sound like that. Like, if you see a fault in a believer, then you should show that to them or reflect it to them. But it can also mean that we, as mu'min, human mu'mins, are reflections or mirrors of al-mu'min, Allah. And then the other thing is, in terms of how do you explain it to a child, what came up for me was the ayah in Surah Quraysh, الذي أطعمهم من جوع وآمنهم من خوف. So, aman is like the opposite of fear in a way. And so, mu'min is the one that covers, or even the dua, Allahumma astur awrati wa amin rawahati. So like, I don't know what rawa translates to in English, but it's just like, for me, it's like the opposite of fear, and being covered perhaps, or the fear being covered, or being what's it called, soothed. And in English also there's a saying like faith over fear. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, no, mashallah, that's beautiful. I think that's very true to how I see it as well. I think like if I think about it in the most like abstract philosophical sense, the most basic belief that we might ever have, right, is that we are safe, right? Like, to believe really is it kind of to, in the same sense, it kind of, in a sense, to feel safe, right? Because you have to, at least believe that you have, or feel that you have the freedom to believe in something, to pick something, right, and say that it's true. Yeah, maybe that's a bit abstract, but I think we can kind of lean on the morphology a bit more, right? Because I was saying how that form of mu'min, muf'il, right, has like the sense of like instrumentality. Um, um, so I think, in a lot of ways, a believer is somebody who makes, himself feel safe. He makes others feel safe. He is a tool. He's an instrument of God that makes, that creates safety and security around him. So yeah, I mean, like I said, some of these initial roots, right, are very basic concepts, right? So they're very like intuitive, and maybe that makes it a little bit difficult to kind of talk about. But I think, we can kind of just leave it at that, right? Like, to believe, is to feel safe in a sense, right? When you believe in something, you you choose to believe in it, right? Because it validates you in some way. Yeah. Anyone have any thoughts on that? Any more thoughts on that? Khair, inshallah. I mean, there's no problem with these conversations being short. That was kind of my vision from the start. I feel like there's a little bit more I want to say about this root, about faith and security being tied together, but it's sort of escaping me. So maybe something we can continue in the group chat. I think the last thing we can kind of say maybe is back to Muhaymin, right? I think what I want to say is kind of like, I kind of want to bridge that gap between like, how do we use the same word for humans and God, right? Like, and the translation here, I think, is kind of apt, right? So like, the mu'min, like I kind of just said, the believer, as a believer in God, as a believer in the Quran, as a believer in the Prophet ﷺ and his Sunnah and the Quran, we are also people who give iman or give faith and security and safetiness to others, right? So that's part of what it means, to me at least, to be a believer, right? Is somebody that is an instrument of God, right? So if we think of it in that sense, right, then if we as believers are instruments of God, are people who make others feel safe and make others feel secure. Who is the most extreme example of that? He is Allah, right? Allah is the most extreme example of that, right? So if we are, believers, if we are those who enjoins safety and security, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is the epitome of one who enjoins safety and security, right? And then to confirm that, right, Allah adds the next name, Al-Muhaymin, right? So He's not just the believer, but He is the believer times 10, right? He's not just mu'min, but He is muhaymin, right, as well. And haymana is a word that I think some scholars think came after al-muhaymin, right? So it's the infinitive form of that word, and it means really to dominate, right? I read recently that it's also the root word for or the origin of the word hegemony in English. So in English we use hegemony to mean like an idea or institution or something that dominates the minds of most people, or most it's the prevailing kind of way of thinking or believing in a period of time or space or something like that, or region. So I'm not sure about that relationship etymologically. It's very interesting, but yeah. So haymana, right? That people have kind of drawn a noun out of this name al-muhaymin, because in order to provide security, right, you have to really be able to dominate, right? So like you cannot be somebody like if you ever had to be a caretaker to somebody, right? Like if you ever had to take care of a child, for example, or if you have kids, you know that like you can't make your child secure or safe unless you have an ability to kind of dominate, an ability to kind of secure the perimeter, right? You have to have some sort of power, some ability to kind of cast away any kind of danger, right? And that's really what's captured by these two names as well, but especially by al-muhaymin, right? Because if a mu'min, is an instrument, is a means of giving iman, giving faith and safety and security, and Allah is the most extreme example of that. Logically, what that means is that like He has the ability, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has the ability to fend off or divert away any danger as He wills.
Can I add something?
Yeah, of course.
Subhanallah, that just reminded me of something. So there's a surah in the Quran named Al-Mu'minun, and I was just looking at it like in terms of description. There's a lot of description, but what you said just now about dominating or like being, I guess, I guess maybe I don't want to say dominion, but some sort of like hierarchical relationship. It says here, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِأَمَانَاتِهِمْ وَعَهْدِهِمْ رَاعُونَ. And what you said about, so it's like mu'minun, one of the descriptions of the mu'minun is that for their amanat or their trust, whatever they're entrusted with, that they are ra'un. And ra'i, of course, also I think is from a hadith of Rasulullah about kullukum ra'i. Each one of you is a shepherd or a caretaker over things. And so that implies like, what you said, like a relationship of hierarchy. The other thing was about, I think it was last week that we did Ya Salam. And I just wanted to point out the difference that Allah says between, oopsie. قالت الأعراب آمنا قل لم تؤمنوا ولكن قولوا أسلمنا ولما يدخل الإيمان في قلوبكم وإن تطيعوا الله ورسوله لا يلتكم من أعمالكم شيئا إن الله غفور رحيم إنما المؤمنون الذين آمنوا بالله ورسوله ثم لم يرتابوا. So there is this sense of like Allah is saying that the Arab or the Bedouins have said that they amanna, that they have believed or become mu'min, but tell them you haven't become mu'min, you've become Muslim or you've surrendered. And then there's a description that mu'minun are those people who have faith, who come in faith, and then they don't doubt after that. So I thought that was a good distinction.
Yeah, no, two very beautiful points. Jazakallah khair. I think one thing we can kind of add to that is, when we talk about iman, this form of the word if'al, really it has the sense of a process, right? Something that's ongoing. So the ayah that you mentioned, where there's a distinction between Islam and Iman, right, which have the same pattern, right, the same vowel pattern, the same morphological pattern. They both have this sense of a process, whereas Islam is more kind of as we talked about in the previous session, that root having a lot to do with submission, but also peace and deliverance. So that's more like a physical thing. And then that's why in the Quran Allah says, don't say that you have Iman, say you only have Islam, right? Because Iman has not entered into, you haven't gotten to that phase yet, you haven't gotten to that stage yet. You've only gone through the physical part, the spiritual or the abstracted or the metaphysical part. That stage hasn't happened yet. Yeah, Jazakallah khair for that. For those notes. I think one other note I wanted to make, and this is kind of even as an Arabic speaker, this gets a little tricky for me, but just to kind of help you kind of ground that idea of instrumentality or active participle. When we say mu'min, and we say with that pattern muf'il, the opposite of it, or the passive mode of it will be muf'al. Right? So muf'al is the passive participle, and muf'il is the active participle. And then so the intensive forms of that would be mufa'il, like we said, is the intensive active participle, like muhaymin. And then the intensive passive participle will be mufa'al, right, like Muhammad. So another good example is in the Quran when Allah describes Yusuf alayhi salam. So he uses the word mukhlas. Mukhlis. Mukhlas. See, I told you it's confusing. Even as an Arabic speaker. But yeah, if you look at the root here for khalasa, which means to be sincere. So I think it's Surah 12, active participle. Yeah, Surah 12 is the first instance of that word. So كذلك لنصرف عنه السوء والفحشاء إنه من عبادنا المخلصين. Right, so Yusuf is described as being a mukhlas, right? So he's the passive participle. He's not, Allah doesn't describe him using the active participle, meaning that he makes the effort to be sincere. He describes him in the passive, right? Which means that Allah made him sincere. So just a little technical point there that I hope kind of really grounds that idea, right? That of the mu'min being, an active thing, an instrument of God. Right? To believe is to be an instrument of the thing that you believe in, which I think is, a really beautiful idea. Khair, inshallah. I think that kind of wraps it up. If anybody has any final thoughts, or if any final thoughts come to you later on, please feel free to share in the group. Any feedback is always welcome, and let's keep the conversation going. Inshallah. Jazakumullah khair for your participation and your time. And I think there's some new faces or new ears with us today. So, just to kind of say that we usually are not this technical. It's just because these two names are very closely related. Looking at the morphology helps a lot of the time, but most of the conversation is usually focused on the root and, how meanings are coming together. How do we understand this, idea in the most basic sense? And like I try to kind of say or imply, and the main kind of motivation behind this app is that when we look at meanings in the Arabic language, or in any language really, what we're trying to kind of show in the simplest sense is that all of these words that are related to one root really kind of represent one idea. So like, if we just want to, if I'd like to kind of end it on this, kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Amalgam of ideas, right? Like this root, ma, na, right? Those sounds, when they come together in the Arabic language, they mean all of these things. They mean to believe, they mean faith, they mean security, they mean trustworthiness. All of these ideas are kind of, one primal or primordial idea, in the mind, within the self. And they kind of fractal or break apart into different ideas that we use in speech and in writing. But really, they're just one. They really come from like one singular idea, and that's the goal of these sessions. Is kind of try and explore these primordial ideas, if you will. And I think I'll leave it at that, unless if anyone has any final thoughts. Jazakallah khair again. And thank you for your time and attention. Jazakumullah khair.